This is the last lecture for American literature, and it is a summary and wrapping up of what we have covered during the term. What I hope to cover in this particular lecture is a review of some of the key content of the course and what every college student should know about literature and why. So let's look at the foundations of literature and studying literature in general. First of all, the definition of literature is defined as books and other written works, especially those considered to have creative or artistic merit or lasting value. It can either be prose, which is written in paragraph, or poetry written in stanzas. Entire books have been written in poetry that are essentially stories. There are four main types of literature: fiction, novels, which are long stories, short stories, and a new one called flash fiction, which is usually less than 1,000 words. Then there is poetry, of which there are many kinds, including song lyrics and sonnets. And nonfiction, which includes essays, autobiographies, and anything that is not fiction. And finally, drama, which includes plays and movies. We did not study any drama in this class because the drama of the early American literature is not particularly worth reading. When we look at a timeline of American literature, we have early American literature, which is basically from about 1695 to 1820. Its primary content was talking about religion and family, and an example would be Abigail Adams. From about 1820 to 1865 was Romanticism, which valued intuition and emotional content. And we read stories by Washington Irving, and I had a choice, James Fenimore Cooper. Concurrent with Romanticism was the subcategory of it called Gothic, which started about 1830, and we still do a lot of Gothic literature today. Stephen King would be a primary example, and is primarily concerned with supernatural events. And authors that we read were Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne. In 1861 to 1865 was the Civil War, and this is a dividing line in American literature and American life. Literature after the Civil War changed, with realism, which as a literary trend ran from about 1865 to 1900, and it involved looking at real people in real settings. Mark Twain in fiction and Walt Whitman in poetry pretty much were writing in the realistic style. An offshoot of realism is naturalism, which was very influential from about 1880 to 1920, and it basically looked at man against nature or society. And again, examples that you might have read would be Jack London and Paul Dunbar. So what are the key influences on American literature? First of all, our history and what has happened to America has greatly affected our literature. The Civil War, as we had mentioned, had a profound impact on literature, as did World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War. All have profound impact on American literature. The second is the innate optimism of Americans, that life can be better and that we can make it better if we work hard to try. We are not normally a very pessimistic society that things are bad and will get worse. We have an affinity to nature, particularly nature as seen in the wild. The Hudson River School, for example, painted in the 1820s through 1870s, looked at nature and painted stunning natural scenes with people almost absent from them. We also believe in individualism, as personified by Daniel Boone, who was a real person who moved into the Kentucky, Tennessee area to found communities there and make his own way in the West. And he became a folk hero, along with Davy Crockett, who was in the same vein. We believe in originality and inventiveness. Again, Thomas Edison is, in the 1800s, the supreme example of that, with his multiple inventions. And finally, we are greatly influenced by our immigration. Each group of people that migrated to the United States, either voluntarily or involuntarily, as with slaves, brought bits of their own culture with them. All you need to do is go to a food court and you will see how many different nationalities we have appropriated their food traditions. So what did Americans write about? American literature is in a unique approach to writing. It tends to be very individualistic and very much looking at nature, originality, creativeness, individualism. It covers the range of human experiences, from lofty self-sacrificing to downright raunchy stories. It expresses the diversity of the American experience, and it expresses the individual in life over the group. That one must be a person first and then become part of a group, as opposed to many other nationalities, the Chinese in particular, where the group is more important than the individual. So let's look at fiction and some key things in fiction that you need to know. Fiction is a deliberately fabricated account of something. It can be a literary work based on imagination rather than fact, like a novel or short story. Fiction is writing that the author knows is not true. So what are some of the key terms? Plot is what happens in a story, and setting is where and when it happens. So if you saw the recent movie A Star is Born, which the plot is the main character gets discovered as a singing sensation and she grows and becomes a great star. The setting is contemporary America, and it revolves around the music scene in the United States. Another important feature of fiction is the narrative arc, and you will find it in almost all fiction. If you watch anything on TV, reality TV, which is scripted, you will find the narrative arc there. And it starts with a setup where a situation is set up and things happen to the main character or characters that results in some sort of crisis and comes to a climax in which the main character will either succeed in overcoming the challenges or fail. And then there is the falling action and ends with some sort of resolution where there is a new point where things are stable again before a new crisis occurs. And if you think about it, this is the way life goes. We go from things that are calm and settled, and then something happens that upsets our life. We either solve it or we don't, and then it fades away and we come to some sort of resolution of it. In fiction, you have the protagonist, who is a hero, and the antagonist, who is a villain. And if you think of Popeye and Bruto, they are the classic hero and villain. And again, one of the things American heroes may have is that they may seem to be the underdog, that they are not up to the challenge of defeating the villain, but in the end, they do succeed. Some of the key authors that we have read were Washington Irving, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Mark Twain, Herman Melville, and Kate Chopin. Poetry. Americans have written a great deal of good poetry and even more bad poetry. So if we define poetry is a type of literature based on the interplay of words and rhythm. It often employs rhyme and meter as a set of governing the number and arrangement of syllables in a line. In poetry, words are strung together to form sounds, images, and ideas that might be too complex or abstract to describe directly. So, rhythm is a major part of English poetry, and particularly American poetry. And if we look at it, there are several main things that define rhythm. The first is the line. It's one line of a stanza. So if you look at the poem, Once Upon a Midnight Dreary, While I Pondered Weak and Weary, which is by Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, that is a line. A stanza is a group of lines that create a unit. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. The meter is the rhythm of a line and stanza by stressed and unstressed syllables. And so a metric foot is the smallest unit of rhythm. So once up is 1 metric foot. And so you string them together and you can get a metric line. So once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary. This is a stress pattern, an unstressed pattern, that is called a trochee. The opposite, which would be unstressed stressed, would be an iamb. But my main concern is that you understand that there is a rhythm to poetry, that it's not just a collection of words like it might be in prose, that the rhythm is as important to the poem as the words themselves. Poetry is meant to be heard. The arrangement of the rhythm and the flow of sounds is critical to poetry. Alliteration is a repetition of consonants. While I nodded, nearly napping, notice all the repetitions of the N sounds. And imagery is what the reader sees as he or she reads. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volumes of forgotten lore, while I nodded, nearly napping, there suddenly came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door. Only this, and nothing more. And so the image that this first stanza of this poem entails is someone that is exhausted, ready to fall asleep, and is disturbed by someone knocking at the door. And so the visual of this is as important as the sounds that the poem makes. Some of the key authors that we read are Walt Whitman, who is the most important American poet, and Emily Dickinson, who is ranked very high as well, Paul Dunbar, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Amy Lowe, and Edward Arlington Robinson. These are all poets who were productive before 1900s. After 1900s, we have another whole group of poets, many of whom are influenced by Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson. Nonfiction. Nonfiction, or nonfiction, sometimes you'll see it hyphenated, is content that purports in good faith to represent truth, accuracy regarding information, events, or people. Nonfiction content may be presented either objectively or subjectively, meaning as factual information or subjectively personal experience. And many times it takes the form of a story. Many biographies and autobiographies are story-based. It is important to remember that nonfiction is what the writer believes to be true. You, the reader, do not need to believe it is true. And what kinds of things are considered nonfiction? Essays, biographies, autobiographies, and memoirs, science books, philosophy books, history books, travel books, anything that the author says is real and factual. Reading nonfiction takes special skills. It means that you need to have a skeptical mind, saying that what the author is telling you does not necessarily be true, even though the author says it is true. So this means that you need to read critically, asking yourself who, what, when, where, why about the information you are reading. Even textbooks can have errors in them. And you need to do a critical analysis by comparing it to other things that you know. Does this fit in with other things that I have read or that I have been told? And if it's contradictory, then you need to decide if you're going to believe some of it or all of it. The critical skills also mean that you need to verify the information. Is the author qualified to write about what he or she is writing about? If you go to the internet, anyone can post anything on the internet. And there's a lot of people that write stuff that they are not qualified to write about. So you need to look and say, is the person qualified? You also need to look and see if the date that is written is relevant to the content. For example, if you're reading something on genetics that was written 50 years ago, the information is going to be dated. In fact, anything over 5 to 6 years probably is dated in genetics because it is changing so fast. If you're reading something about Edgar Allan Poe, who lived a century and a half ago, and the authors that you are reading comments about him written maybe 50 years after Poe, that information still may be relevant. It depends upon how much information changes over time. You need to look for bias. Now, everything has some bias to it. It's something that we cannot avoid. Some things are more biased than others, where they are trying to set up their own particular view and will include information that only fits their point of view. We are going into political season with elections, and politicians are very good at giving biased message. You need to ask, is the information complete or skewed? Are they leaving out information that is relevant, only picking those facts that support their point of view? And is it have a logical organization? Some key nonfiction authors, of which we read very few of them because they tend to be longer than I wanted you to read and more difficult to read without more direct guidance from me, would be Benjamin Franklin, who wrote a very biography, Nat Turner, who was a slave and started a slave rebellion, and he wrote an autobiography. Ralph Waldo Emerson was the preeminent essay writer of the 1800s. His works are still read today and are considered very influential. Harriet Jacob, which you read, her Life of a Slave. Henry David Thoreau, again, a very famous author of the 1800s. He wrote Walden Pond. It was his experiment of living by himself. And his essay, Civil Disobedience, has been very influential. It influenced Mahatma Gandhi and Martin Luther King. And finally, another nonfiction writer would be Frederick Douglass. He was a slave, became free, and became a very prominent person in civil rights in the 1800s. So, why is this class important to you? First of all, a college degree assumes more than just knowledge in a profession. So, knowing about the medical field and how to take blood pressures and billing and anatomy and medical terminology is all important for a professional, but a college degree assumes that you have a much broader base of knowledge, which is why you have the general classes like American literature, philosophy, oral communication, algebra. It assumes a wider understanding of the world. It is too easy to see only what you are taught in the professional classes and not understand the people that are living in the world now. And these other classes, like the American literature class, exposes you to a wider range of people and situations. It increases the shared knowledge of common resources and heritage of an educated society. If you watch The Simpsons at all, they have included almost all of the people that we have studied in at least one or two episodes of The Simpsons over their 30-year period, because they assume people who watch the show would know who these people are. So why this class and the way that it is structured? Because I know it is structured differently than your other classes are. Most of your other classes are linear, where you need to know one piece of information and then you move on to another piece that builds on that. This class does not really do that. I think of it as a flower garden, and it's an exploration where you go out and you pick various flowers and you smell them and see if you like them. So it's more of a sampling. Some of the things that you read you will like, and some of them you don't like, and that is perfectly fine. There is no reason why you need to like everything that you read, but you at least know and are developing a sense of what is good and what is bad in writing. Besides teaching you the basics of early American literature, I also wanted you to increase the range of reading skills. Most of the reading that you do in school is textbook related, which is nonfiction. That is one approach to reading, but there are many other ways and other things that people express their ideas. They express them through novels and short stories, they express them through poetry. And so you need to be able to read those kinds of pieces of writing and see how people express their ideas that are not a textbook. It improves your critical reading skills, because what I wanted from all of your assignments was your opinion. Why do you like it or don't like it? What is your thoughts on it? It also was to sample some of the literature that are the foundations of American society. Washington Irving's Sleepy Hollow, Rip Van Winkle, Edgar Allan Poe, The Raven, have become part of American culture. They have been turned into movies, variations of movies, up until the present. And so by reading the originals, you can see how the original author perceived the topic and how later interpretations of those ideas have developed. The other thing I want is for you to learn about human experience. In fiction, you can experience other people's lives that you do not have to experience yourself. You would not want to experience slavery, but reading about it and another person's experience of it gives you a feeling for how they lived. You would not want to live through the Civil War and all the bloodshed and loss, but reading about it gives you the empathy to it. It opens your mind to new experiences. You learn how America has interpreted that experience. You understand how that experience influences our daily lives. If you looked at some of the explorations, the purpose of the explorations was to give you a wider context to what America was like in the 1800s, and so you can see how our world has changed, and it is changing now. Americans appreciate originality, and so change is something that we like. And also I was hoping that you appreciate and enjoy literature in all of its forms. So in summary, I really want you to read, think, and enjoy what you are reading. Thank you.